Justin Boone, let's get into it. Who are the 4 quarterbacks that people should be adding this week?
I really feel like at some point we should have bumped quarterbacks to the end of this segment because it's always such a boring way to start. It has been rough. Like the last few weeks looking for a quarterback on the waiver wire, there has not been much to choose from. And that's why I'm including a couple guys here that are over the 50% rostered mark, which in my column, I mentioned them just as like one-liners. If they're kind of between 50 and 60% rostered, but it makes sense to just throw them in so that people know and they can look for them just in case they're available. I mean, it's not even great with these guys. Trevor Lawrence going against the Jets in a game that, like we said earlier, we think the Jaguars are going to be able to control that game. He can probably do pretty well in that one, and he's played better recently, multiple touchdowns in 3 straight. I think they're going to roll in that one, so you just kind of chase the points there. Sam Darnold versus the Colts, another game where we think that they're probably going to have no problem beating that banged-up Colts squad. He's coming off a 3-touchdown game last week, and that team's probably just going to be really dejected too, right? So the Seahawks are going to have a fantastic outing in that one. Let's just hope that we don't have multiple defensive and special teams touchdowns that prevents the offense from putting up all the points. And then it gets fun, right? Then it gets to the guys who are actually available in a bunch of leagues.
Fun.
JJ McCarthy against the Cowboys. And this tells you how bad it is on the waiver wire, Harmon, that we have to look at JJ McCarthy potentially starting for some people in the fantasy playoffs. I don't even want to recommend this, but I promise you, if you go look at the other options, there is nothing else out there. There are not other guys that offer you the kind of ceiling, 3 touchdown kind of games. There's not many of them out there. Do you really want to be starting Aaron Rodgers and guys? You don't, right? So we're looking at McCarthy. We're, hanging our hat on the fact that the schedule is very easy. He's getting this matchup against the Cowboys this week. It's a fantastic matchup, as we mentioned earlier. He's going to be able to put up points against them, I think, as long as they stick to this quick, get the ball out of his hands, keep the offense moving. And yet still, I don't feel good about it, Harmon. I'm not excited to put him in any lineup. And then Bryce Young, who was coming off bye, has a pair of 3-touchdown games in his last 3 outings. He went against the Saints in week 10. I shouldn't even be making the argument against myself, but I am. Went against the Saints in week 10. It was not that long ago. Had one of his worst outings of the season. 124 passing yards, no touchdowns, 1 interception, 1 fumble. And yet you just kind of got to hope that maybe the light turned on for him in the last few weeks and that they're going to be really prepared coming off the bye and be able to put up some points in that game. But yeah, if you are a Daniel Jones manager and you're looking for somebody on the waiver wire this week, I wish you good luck because there are not a lot of good options out there.
I mean, Trevor Lawrence has been the number 1 waiver wire quarterback for so long. He could be the 3rd co-host of this podcast. He's been right there for such a long time. Oh my God. What are the producers are literally baiting me with these stats. Okay. So since the merger, only 2 quarterbacks have thrown for exactly 364 passing yards in their 3rd career start. Tom Brady and Shedeur Sanders. Oh, here's another Shedeur Sanders one. Games with 300 plus passing yards this season. Shedeur Sanders 1, Drake May, Caleb Williams, Trevor Lawrence, Cam Ward 0. Just the bait is there, and I've taken the bait. I mean, you want to add Shedeur Sanders at this point? I don't know about that.
No, there is no reason to go out and get Shedeur Sanders. He's had a really easy schedule that he's done this against, and the games haven't been that great, but I'm really happy for him. I'm looking at this from a fantasy perspective, right? And from a fantasy perspective, I don't think you want to chase, what he did last week. And I think he's benefited from going against some easier defenses, like the Titans in that last game. I don't know that he is going to be a real fantasy asset down the stretch, but it's awesome to see. And it makes Stefanski look pretty bad that they didn't see this in him earlier. But that also doesn't surprise me at all because it's dictated by draft capital, and Dylan Gabriel, they took earlier and they had to prove to themselves he's not the guy. He's not. At least maybe Shedeur can become the longtime backup there.
Yeah, and I mean, he could make things interesting. Apparently, they're going to bring Deshaun Watson back for whatever reason next year. So, Shedeur and Deshaun Watson, Browns QB room 2026. Have fun with that. No, I think he is interesting, at least in like Superflex leagues in this matchup against the Bears. And he's going to be able to get the football to a guy that we're talking about in a later section. So, we'll come back to that point there. But just one point underscoring Sam Darnold. Charvarius Ward is in the concussion protocol for the 3rd time this year. And obviously, Sauce Gardner likely out for a few more weeks. So, certainly a good matchup for Sam Darnold. He would be of the guys who are, available and not 50%, but close to it. He's certainly someone that is top of my list there. Let's get to the running back position. Who are we adding off the waiver wire at running back?
I mean, a lot of familiar names that we've talked about in recent weeks. We're looking at Chris Rodriguez Jr. going up against the Giants, Bam Knight at the Texans. I'll explain why. It's not for that matchup that we're necessarily picking up Bam Knight, but there's a reason why you want to pick him up if he's out there. Blake Corum, who we just talked about, looks fantastic as the backup there and is putting up RB3, if not RB2 numbers as the complementary option in that backfield. And then Devin Singletary, who we also mentioned in a good matchup with the Commanders, and he's able to produce even if he is playing in that secondary role behind Tyron Tracy Jr. But there is still a chance that Tyron Tracy Jr. might not be 100% coming off the bye. So we're going to keep an eye on that. But Rodriguez, I mean, he's coming off a quieter game. It was a tougher matchup with the Vikings, just 10 carries for 52 yards. But he is the lead back in this offense. And this was the matchup that weeks ago when I brought him up, this was the matchup we were looking at. Go up against the Giants. It's a great opponent. He will be able to produce if he continues to be that lead back, which I expect him to. We're not really seeing any signs that Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt is coming to take this job back. So it's going to be Rodriguez, and he's been good, right? He posted 65 yards and a score against the Seahawks, a touchdown against the Lions, 85 yards on 16 touches in the loss to the Dolphins, 41 yards and a touchdown against the Broncos. So those are usable fantasy stats. He's not coming in to win you your league, but he can get into your lineup this week as an upside RB3. Bam Knight. So we got to have the Trey Benson conversation, right? I don't know about you, Harmon. It doesn't seem like he's coming back, right? He came back for one limited practice. Since then, 5 straight DNPs. When Gannon was asked about it, he basically couldn't confirm or deny. He's like, I don't know if he's going to come back this year. I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what he said, right? And that tells me that they don't have a lot of confidence that he's going to get activated. And if he's not activated this week, then that's it for the season. Then he remains on IR. So I think we're looking at Bam Knight being the lead back the rest of the way. I'm hoping that Benson comes back to practice this week and can prove me wrong. But if it's Knight, like I said, this Texans matchup, it's very scary. You don't want to do anything against this Texans defense. You don't want to start players. It's after that we're looking at. Falcons in week 16, they give up the 10th most fantasy points to running backs. Bengals in week 17, the best matchup for fantasy backs. So Bam Knight is going to have something to say if he's the starter for this offense the rest of the way. Corum, we don't need to rehash it. He looks fantastic, and he can produce for you as an RB3 flex, maybe more. And yeah, Singletary going up against the Commanders, great matchup there, regardless of whether he's starting, if Tracy's hurt, or whether he's the backup, which it looks like he is going to be back in that backup role. But he's produced, man, like at least 45 scrimmage yards in 5 straight contests while playing out there with Tyron Tracy. And when he did get more snaps, like I mentioned earlier, 102 yards and a score in that last game. So Singletary still getting it done. A motor, right? Motor Singletary, the nickname. He can still produce, and he's somebody that you could go out and pick up and potentially play this week if you're in a pinch.
Yeah, definitely some familiar names there and players we've talked a lot about. And I certainly need Bam Knight I need to make it to week 17 so that Bam Knight can play the Cincinnati Bengals. My God, what is Trey McBride going to do to the Bengals? You just know because fantasy football is fantasy football. He's going to have like 5 catches for 38 yards in that game. You just know it deep down in your bones. That is totally what's happening. Okay, let's get to wide receivers here because we've got 4 really interesting names. I wouldn't say we have any like true, oh my God, smash, this guy's going to win you your leagues, but 4 interesting names to talk about here, Boone.
Yeah, Luther Burden versus the Browns, Jaden Reed at the Broncos, Jalen Coker, who we brought up many times against the Saints, and then Ryan Flournoy versus the Vikings. And for Burden, this all comes down to Rome Odunze, right? And he missed week 14. It's a stress fracture in his foot. It doesn't seem like that's an injury that he's coming back soon from him. I think this is more week to week than day to day. I think he's going to miss at least another game with this one. And in this game, I know it wasn't like the most exciting for fantasy. It was 6 targets, 4 catches, 67 yards. Burden also had 3 yards on the ground in that game, but he led the team in all those categories, right? Well, not the rushing production, obviously, but in the receiving stuff, targets, catches, yards. He was leading the team in those categories. So that's great to see. You want to see when a rookie gets out there, he's producing. And this guy mentioned on our Sunday morning show, but I just love the way he carries himself. He's already carried himself like he's a superstar receiver. I think it's only a matter of time until he gets there. So I'm excited about him. But again, for fantasy at the moment, it's just like, wide receiver 4 flex. And if we get confirmation that Odunze's out, maybe we bump him up into that wide receiver 3 range. Jayden Reed, we've talked about him many times. We wanted to see what he was going to do when he came back here. Played 47% of the snaps, which I think is a little low. We know he's not a full-time player in this offense normally, but 47%, a little lower than what he normally plays when he is healthy. 31 yards, though, on 4 catches, 22 yards on 2 carries. You'd like to see him doing that, getting over 50 yards in his first game back. A pretty, formidable secondary looms in week 15. So this is a matchup with the Broncos that you might not want to start him in, but go pick him up, put him on your bench, see what he can do in this contest, and then you go from there, you reassess, and maybe he gets back into your lineup. And I've mentioned before, there have been stretches of his career where he has produced like a top 12, top 15 fantasy receiver. I don't necessarily think that's going to happen here, but that's just to tell you the kind of ceiling that he could potentially provide if everything goes right for him. Coker coming off a bye. I believe we talked about him before the bye. Prior to 50 yards in 2 of his last 3 games, including that season high 4 for 74 and 1 in week 13. And I've mentioned this stat before, I think it was earlier in the season, but if we remove that first game of the 2024 season, we only played less than 10% of the snaps in that one. If you take that one out of the mix and you make, the rest of his numbers on pace over a full 17 game season, he was on pace for 800 yards. And that was as a rookie. So I know I'm kind of tinkering with the stats a little bit there, but still, this guy could produce. We've talked about him being potentially the best fit to be the number 2 in that offense. He's coming off his best game. Let's see if after the bye, he can build on that. And then Ryan Flournoy, it's just coming down to the CeeDee Lamb thing. If Lamb is healthy, if he clears concussion protocol, then you don't really even need to roster him. But if Lamb doesn't play in this game, we saw a ceiling performance from him, 115 yards and a touchdown last time out. So you look at him as a potential guy that could get in your lineup, but it's all about whether Lamb is going to be able to clear concussion protocol or not.
Like I said earlier, I thought he looked good in that game. I thought he's run some good routes. So I'm floor curious again. That's where I'm at with Ryan Flournoy right now. Yeah, Luther Burden didn't play more snaps with Rome Odunze out. That's the only thing that's tough. He was obviously the most productive guy. I think he's the second best receiver on that team outside of Rome Odunze with where DJ Moore is at this point. But they basically just stuck Olamide Zaccheaus in Rome Odunze's vacated kind of move around role, which is a bit of a bummer for Luther Burden. Can't really count on him. I'll note on Jayden Reed that the Broncos, I think Christian Watson probably draws past Surtain, which that's a matchup we'll talk about later in the week when it comes down to start-sit decisions. But the Broncos have allowed the 5th most air yards and the 8th most targets to receivers lined up in the slot this year. And typically it is kind of that number 2 receiver that draws a lot of the targets in that game. In games against the Broncos, Riley Moss, the second outside corner, he'll get got every now and again. So, and Reed, I thought looked good, and he did draw some defensive attention. So, again, you can't, if we're putting him on the trust meter, we can't say full trust for Jayden Reed based on the playing time and everything like that. But I think there are more positive indicators for him, if you need to play him. And, I'm always going to be excited about Jalen Coker, so no need to add any words on that one. Let's get to the tight ends here. Yet another group of familiar faces here in the tight end section. I would say if we're going to start a 4-man pod here based on how often their faces have appeared in the YouTube algorithm for the Yahoo Fantasy Forecast, it's going to be me, it's going to be you, it's going to be Trevor Lawrence, it's going to be Harold Fannin. So look out for our debut show in 2026.
Yeah, so Fannin and Colston Loveland, we mentioned basically every week. I don't know how they aren't over that 50% rostered mark. They're both at 40%.
Especially
rostered. Fannin. Yeah, they're both producing low-end tight end 1s to high-end tight end 2s. I would think that they'd want to be rostered in every fantasy league, and yet that's not the case. We also have Isaiah Likely here going up against the Bengals again. We mentioned him earlier. He had a good game against them a couple weeks ago. In the last 2 weeks, he's really come on. So you figure if every other tight end in the world can put up points on the Bengals, why can't Likely do it again here? And then Darren Waller didn't have a great game last week. I definitely whiffed on my bold prediction for him. And yet we saw what he did before his injury earlier in the season, the touchdowns. He can get there any given week, right? He can find the end zone. He could put up a decent day. So we're looking at him as well here. And Fannin, normally we just skim over him in this section. We don't even really talk about him. We just go, yeah, Harold Fannin's here again, moving on kind of thing. But it is probably worth mentioning, right? He's the tight end 11 in fantasy points per game on the year. Over the last 3 weeks, David Njoku, he's been playing through a little bit of an injury. And yes, Shedeur Sanders has gotten out there under center and he's targeting Fannin a whole bunch. But we've seen Fannin's playing time increase over this last little stretch. And over these 3 weeks, he's moved up to the tight end 4 in fantasy points per game during that span. And then Njoku hurt his knee on Sunday. I don't know if that's going to cost him time moving forward, but we really could see Fannin out there as a full-time player in this offense, as essentially like the de facto number 1 pass catcher in the offense. It's exactly what you want, right? And he's coming off an 8-catch, 114-yard, 1-touchdown game. Why would you not chase that? Why would he not be rostered everywhere? Colston Loveland, not really putting up the exact same stats like Fannin is, not getting the same kind of volume, but talent-wise, he definitely passes the eye test, and he is still producing, right? Since week 9, he's the tight end 6 in fantasy points per game. I think he looks like a potential superstar. You hope that the volume eventually gets there to allow him to be that kind of thing for fantasy, but he's in, like I said, that low-end tight end 1, high-end tight end 2 range. And the likely conversation we already had, that he had 5 catches for 95 yards against them 2 weeks ago. And he's had these opportunities where he hasn't been able to catch these touchdowns, or he's fumbled right at the goal line, or he caught the touchdown and the refs ruled it not a catch for some reason. He could have had much bigger games these last 2 weeks, and yet he still came through for fantasy in both contests. So going up against the Bengals, you want to start your tight ends there. I think he is a great play again this week.
Yeah, just to underscore the Harold Fannin point, there are 12 tight ends that have averaged, obviously a few of the guys I'm going to say here are rookies. They're not finished, but like averaged over 8 PPR, half PPR points per game as rookie tight ends. These are the following players: Brock Bowers, Sam Laporta. Weirdly enough, because I'm queuing this up on True Media, and this is since 2005, by the way. Tim Tebow and Jordan Matthews show up there. So I'm just saying that. Let me start the list over here because obviously they didn't play tight end in their rookie seasons. This is where they're listed last. They played in the NFL. Brock Bowers, Sam Laporta, Jordan Reed, Tyler Warren, Evan Ingram, Harold Fannin, Aaron Hernandez, Kyle Pitts, Rob Gronkowski, Oronde Gadsden. So like that's the type of year that Harold Fannin is having. He is definitely somebody I want to be starting here during the fantasy football playoffs. So shout out to Shedeur Sanders. He's playing so well that I really want to start Harold Fannin, who needs to be way more than 40% rostered. That is an absolute crime. All right, Boone, I spoiled it earlier, but tell the people about your 2-for-1 special deep stash candidates heading into week 15.
Yeah, Jalen Wright and Ollie Gordon. For most of the season, Ollie Gordon was playing like the number 2 back, but in this game, they kind of went with like a hot hand approach. Now, it's one game. They were dominating this game, so they could do whatever they wanted, right? And apparently, Achane could have come back for this one, so we don't think the injury is too serious. We're going to monitor this week to see his practice participation. But in this game, Wright was the hotter hand. And, you know, he had a ton of stats, even though Achane had 105 scrimmage yards and a touchdown. So he still got there for fantasy. But we saw Ollie Gordon find the end zone, but we saw Jalen Wright go crazy, 107 yards and a touchdown. If you had to pick between them, he's the guy that I would stash here. Really, we're not looking necessarily like he's going to get a start this week. It's more just if that Achane injury gets aggravated, if he eventually misses time in the next couple weeks here. We know the Dolphins running game definitely can produce for fantasy, so you want to look to pick up these guys in deeper formats.